Hi there. Sorry, we're getting off to a bit of a slow start. So this past summer, I was kind of lucky enough to start my journey into data science with the Microsoft Data Science Summer School, which is held at Microsoft Research here in New York City. We kind of spent the first 4 weeks of the 8-week program learning about various algorithms, and methods for data science, as well as languages like Python and R. And then the second 4 weeks, we started our own research project that we were supposed to present at the end of the 8-week stretch. So the project I worked on was called The Cost of Public School in New York City, and it was focused on public schools right here in New York City's 5 boroughs. For those who might not live here in NYC, we have a zone school system for public schools that have kindergarten through 8th grade. So what it means is that essentially lawmakers kind of arbitrarily draw lines on a map, and they determine which addresses get to go to a particular school. If you don't live within that zone, your child cannot attend that school and must either go to private school, which has, of course, tuition, or go to their own zone school, which is determined by the map. So while this doesn't really seem like a big deal right off the bat, New York City has some of the best and worst schools in all of New York State and in all of the country, and some are pretty much right next to each other. This is a graph we made during the program that shows the school performance by school zone. The blue is good and the red is bad. And if we zoom in, we can see this effect in action. PS 11 here in Midtown West perform worse than 60% of schools in all of New York State, and PS 59, which is a 10-minute walk away, is the 19th best school in the state. So this kind of raises a lot of issues for the community, especially when the Department of Education proposes changes in boundaries. So, for example, if the boundary between these two schools were shifted a couple of blocks in one direction, it would mean that children who had been attending a high-performing school are now required to attend a very poor-performing school. And if we go back to the previous map, you'll notice that low-performing schools are kind of centralized in recognizable areas, such as the Bronx, parts of Brooklyn like Bushwick, Canarsie, East New York, Flatlands, Crown Heights, essentially low-income parts of the city with lots of low-cost housing. And meanwhile, those looking for an apartment to move or a house to move with their family will have noticed a sharp increase in price within the same neighborhood for school zones that are known for better schools. And so with these in mind, we drafted our hypothesis and got to work. Alrighty, so what was our question? We already knew that housing cost disparity and education disparity in New York City coincided, but by how much? Specifically, we wanted to know what portion of the housing cost in a given zone was associated with the quality of the local school, and we wanted to put a number on that. In our case, since we were all pretty knowledgeable about New York City, all being from New York City, we kind of skipped past wondering about the truth of our statement and went directly to thinking of a way to demonstrate and quantify it. For you guys who are kind of starting out, if you might actually have to go into that thought process about whether your hypothesis is true, especially if you're thinking about a community that you don't know very well or otherwise disconnected from. Societies change pretty quickly, and the best we can do is capture a small snapshot in time. In 10 or 5 years, even all the information that we recently came up with might drastically change. And if gentrification in New York City keeps going as fast as it goes, 5 years might even be a really large amount. That said, maybe what you're working on can make a difference right now. But you have to make sure that the question you're answering is relevant and current to the community that you want to help. So kind of the first thing that we thought of was, imagine this perfect world with unlimited data, all clean, which as a data scientist, we all pretty much know is completely impossible. But we can dream. So in a perfect world, how would you demonstrate the answer to your question? For us, we decided that an ideal experiment would be to sell 2 identical apartments in the same neighborhood directly across the school zone from each other and compare the prices. The zone with the better school should show a measurable increase in the price, and we decided to normalize for the size of the apartment by taking the price per square foot rather than just the flat price. So, from there, we had to break down this ideal problem, which we can't really do. Can't really make 2 identical apartments kind of directly across from each other. So we had to break down this problem into the realm of possibility. We wanted to get housing data from each school zone, control for features of the housing, get an average price for the various types of housing in the zone, and then compare it with the average price of neighboring school zones in the same neighborhood. So essentially, if you're in Park Slope's pretty ritzy area. For the most part, the neighborhood is going to have similar features, which would allow us to control for certain things like proximity to the subway or proximity to various jobs, commerce, various things that people look for when they're trying to buy an apartment. Unfortunately, that was what we would have liked to do if there was unlimited data, and we did not have unlimited data, or even, a substantial amount of data. So in your case, you want to detail your ideal experiment and then break it down into smaller and smaller pieces based on what you can actually acquire. Which leads us to, what can you actually acquire? High quality data, as we all know, and computational time are in short supply, with few exceptions, particularly in social science fields where the research just hasn't been done yet, or people haven't thought to collect data on certain things or collect data well on certain things. Even our more realistic idea to solve this problem was just not possible because of the limited amount of data. And so we had to cut this down even further to consider what data we could get within our 4-week time limit while still remaining true to the problem. So for the cost of public school project, we kind of looked at these things as necessary to stay true to the meat of what we wanted to find. What data do we need on housing? We knew that it wouldn't really make sense to compare a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment price with a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment price. And so we needed to know the features of a particular piece of housing as far as bedrooms, bathrooms, the square footage, and we needed the address to place it inside a school zone. And we needed the square footage, as I mentioned, since we're measuring price per square foot, and of course we actually need a sale price. And we needed a sufficient amount of these in each school zone to be able to get some kind of decent average. So what types of housing could we acquire, and how will the data we can't get affect the impact of our experiment? So this is something that I kind of had a fight with my supervisors about a little bit during the program, and that was that we ended up only including housing or apartment sales. We really could not find a reliable source of rental data that included all of the features that we knew we needed to include. And that would have maybe, we could have done some web crawling, but as far as the time limit, it wasn't really feasible considering what we had to do. And then on top of that, cleaning data from web crawling is even worse than cleaning data that you got from an API. So in the end, we ended up just completely eliminating rental data. But we felt that the sales data should reflect what the rental data would have given us, and so we felt that though it did detract in some way, we should still end up with a result that would carry over once rental data was able to be included. So what other factors could affect housing cost? So like I was saying about the the 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom compared with a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom. It would be a problem to compare an apartment located in an area like Midtown East to one in the South Bronx or Crown Heights. Midtown East is pretty big. It has a name for itself as a ritzy area, and so regardless, the prices there are going to be increased versus, again, the South Bronx or Crown Heights, even if the actual apartments themselves are comparable. So the exact neighborhood and its features would drastically affect the housing costs, and we needed to include that in our model. We would have liked to include more things like proximity to parks and other small things that especially families might be considering when they're looking for a place to live with their kids. But again, in the interest of time, we were unable. So what you guys should do is definitely make sure that you know exactly what you need out of your data set to do your experiment, and potentially be willing to commit to more or less features depending on what data is available to you. If you have a time limit, absolutely make a list of improvements that you can include later on after you've kind of done the meat work on a portion of the data that you really would have liked to collect. So the data, you've made your decisions about what your data needs to look like, and now you actually have to try to get some. So community data sites can be really great if your community has one. In New York City, we have NYC Open Data, which for collecting school information worked really well, and for collecting housing information worked really poorly. We ended up with probably one of the worst situations we could find as far as the housing data, wherein everything was stored, all the details of each piece of housing was stored in a PDF handwritten form. No, not the handwritten PDFs. Like just about the worst thing, for a data scientist to find is that their data that they really need is written in chicken scratch on some form and then scanned into a computer and then stored in a PDF. And we're slowly developing handwriting algorithms that can tell what's there, but that's another mess that a lot of times there's just not enough time to really deal with. So with that in mind, we kind of have to move to third-party sites. And mind you, this is assuming that you don't have like some luck and the government is like, oh, we're handing out this data that we're just giving away for free. For example, New York City recently released all of their turnstile data for the subways. So if you were doing a project on that, great, you already have your data. It's fairly clean, it looks nice. For us, this data was really not anywhere that the city was providing, and so we had to look to third-party sites to get a decent data set. So the problems with third-party data sites is that many of them are not really free and clear to use, even for a research project for a student or just any kind of social science, nonprofit-based type research. You really have to check the terms, and most of the time they'll tell you that maybe you can get some portion of the data for free, and then you have to pay some price, or you have to get some special key and some special access. So there can be a lot of barriers to getting information through a website's API. Of course, you can always just crawl the site, but again, there are issues that come with your data quality through doing that. The API could just be slow, and in general, pulling data from the web can be slow. And on top of that, if you do have an API, you want to respect the site giving you your data by pausing in between your calls so that you're not kind of just swamping them. For us, it took us about 2 or 3 nights of just leaving a desktop on all night long to get the initial data set, which was about 40,000 lines. And, we ended up using a site, StreetEasy, to collect our housing data along with all the details. So fixing your data. Sometimes your research needs researching. As with all freshly harvested data, due diligence is required to clean it up. Preliminary data exploration is important to make sure what you have makes sense. And of course, sense is a very broad term, and it depends on your community and your project. You may need to do further research just to make sure what you have makes sense. And we definitely were constantly going back to the web to cross-reference data that we had with other sites. So for example, if we saw data for a particular school and we were unsure of whether or not that school was really poorly performing or better performing, there are other sites that you can use to get more specific data on the school that are not necessarily easy to pull data directly from. Well, the data looks okay, so this definitely turned out to be a huge problem for us because our cursory summaries of the data, grabbing your means, your medians, quartiles, ranges, they didn't really show anything particularly strange. However, there were quite a few anomalies. Definitely check for duplicate data lines, especially if you're pulling for an API, and also look for wrong information that is obscure to the point that it actually looks realistic. And they're not that easy to find. So in our case, we did not notice anything strange until we started to try to build a model. We looked at the results, and in some cases, so we were doing kind of, we would split the data into two groups, 80 and 20, and train on 80% and test on 20%. And for some of those splits, which we did at random, we would end up with some very strange looking graphs that just didn't really mesh what we thought should happen. And even though we kind of did some basics to the data, like getting rid of missing information in the bedrooms and the bathrooms, or having 0 square footage, or no measure for square footage at all, we found that some of the agents who, I guess, put in the data on StreetEasy would sometimes just kind of list arbitrary numbers for the square footage for absolutely no reason. And so we found quite a few lines of data wherein the square footage was like 10 square feet. And for one of them, we found it with 1 square foot, and it was like a $20 million residence. So every time that particular thing ended up in our test data, our models would just fly all over the place. And if it ended up in the training data, we were actually closer to looking realistic. So we had to kind of run this model several times just to see, okay, it ran okay this time, these numbers look good. It ran okay this time, these numbers look good. And then other times, why are all my numbers so low all of a sudden? Our R squared was coming out at like 10, like 0.19 if this particular anomaly got caught in the wrong set. So in addition, that kind of put a lot of the square footages that we did have to question how many of them were really, kind of just vague estimates, and particularly toward the smaller end. So in New York City, that can get even more difficult, because what if you have kind of a place that's like 500 or 600 square feet? Tiny living is kind of common in New York City, so there may very well be places that are quite small, but still fairly expensive, and it's hard for us to kind of eyeball and tell. So at a point, you kind of just have to use your knowledge of the community that you're dealing with to make sure that your data is making sense, or as much sense as you can possibly get it to make, given what data you're able to get. So due to the issue with the square footage, we actually lost quite a few days of work, which was really terrible. But what this basically means is that reasonable results just don't always mean you have good data. We, for the first several tries of the model, we had decent looking results. And then, that somebody decided, well, let's try it just one more time. And that's when our results kind of, self-destructed. Research, like I said, research on your community and on the specifics of your community is really important. But, as far as using a third-party data site, sometimes, they have their own data standards and they're not yours, absolutely not. And they also have, things that they find important that not only aren't what you find important, but aren't even necessarily what you think they should find important. So, you're thinking Street Easy is a site, that's listing houses. They might want to get their square footage correct or not, apparently. So in addition, we found a lot of duplicate lines of data that were changed by one field, but not a field that we actually needed as far as the results we needed to calculate. So they had like a separate field that involved like a mixture of the school zone and the borough that the school was in, but occasionally we would get the same school in two different boroughs. So for those apartments and houses that kind of lay on a line, we would end up having doubles of those in the data. And we thought we chose Street Easy because we thought, okay, they're letting us actually search their API using school data, which would save us the time of actually having to get addresses, give them latitudes and longitudes, and then match them with shape files and basically put them into a school zone ourselves. Unfortunately, we ended up having to do that anyway because most of the school zones were just completely wrong. So, don't learn this the hard way and spend, a really long time on it like we did. Definitely do your best to check for, small things like that just don't show up in your aggregate data, in your aggregate statistics. So the model, yay, finally we can kind of start doing some real data science-y stuff. So you have as much data as you can get for the project that you want to do. Your preliminary digging has given you what all data scientists love to see, which is a clean data set. Unfortunately, in our case, this pretty much meant that we squashed our original 40,000 lines to less than a quarter. And in certain parts of the city, we had almost nothing. For example, in Queens, by the end, I think we had maybe 12 lines of data for all of Queens, which is the largest borough. So that's pretty terrible. And so for you'll have to decide, do you want to try to find more data, or do you want to model maybe the data that you're missing given what you do have? So for us, our model wasn't created to kind of give us direct results, but instead was used to create kind of a quote-unquote fake data set that would allow us to actually compute the premium associated with the school zone attached to your housing costs. So we were going to use this false data set, which was built on our training data, to actually compute this average both within a school zone and over neighboring school zones in the same neighborhood. So problems with this approach. So the graph on the left here is the kind of a graph that shows you where the school zones in New York City are. You can kind of see that the lines are blocked out. Gray areas are areas of New York City that are not zoned or have not had a school test given in a very long time. So New York City has like their own way that they give out the exams to the schools that determines whether or not they'll be in the data. So the graph on the right is our apartments that we managed to pull. Our apartments are houses that we managed to pull, 1 dot per actual apartment or house. So you can see that kind of in Queens, there's like nothing. And in the Bronx, it's very sparse. Staten Island gets pretty sparse. And as you would kind of expect for a site that's focused on, selling, we're focused kind of in Brooklyn and Manhattan, which are, kind of hopping places to live in New York City at the moment. So, Street Easy, as I mentioned before, has its own agenda, and, it's a site that kind of appeals to realtors and people looking for houses. So they're focused in areas that are, really up and coming, where there are a lot of sales happening right now. And so we decided that, another issue is that they're listing a listing price. So this is not the price that a place necessarily sold for. It's just what it's currently being listed for, which is likely to be on the higher end. And so we definitely believe that at the end, our numbers are scaled a little bit higher. Also, I believe that's a consequence of excluding rental data. But again, we believe that as far as the actual results, we should find similar results regardless. And so we kind of let it go, again, given our time constraints. So it'll be up to you whether or not your current data set can still accurately depict what you want. And at this point, you may decide that it is necessary for you to get more data. But again, that's based on your research in your community. And, either way, you should definitely document places where you feel you're lapsing. So this was our actual model. It's just a simple linear regression model with various features of the apartments to estimate the price per square foot. We also included the school scores because we needed to eventually control for those. And as it turns out, we did kind of two different things. We both tested the name of the neighborhood and the distance from a particular address to the subway. And it turns out that those are about equivalent as far as accuracy in the model. So that was something that I just found really interesting. So the analysis. So first things first, have a diverse team to do your analysis. Variety helps catch errors. It's more than just your flat numbers. You not only have to know what they mean, but what they mean for the community in question. Personal experience can be really big in kind of just finding like places where you might have fallen in some areas. So for example, we actually had former realtors who were now researchers, and we would ask them, okay, for this particular area, we know you sold a lot in this area. Do these numbers look correct as far as our price per square foot? And we got a lot of affirmatives. Of course, we were all New York City residents, so we also had our own idea of what things looked like in our area, and that just helps you like avoid various problems that may come up before you really get like down to business in your analysis. So the people aspect. The reason you're doing, social science conscious research is because I hope that you guys are thinking about people. You're thinking about how to help people, maybe how to help your own community, how to help other communities, and people should be integral to any analysis that you do. In our case, we definitely found that our numbers were reflecting lived experience of people in New York City. And we could use our experiences in that as guides to make our next decision. And just decisions on how we handled data, what data we gathered, what was most important. So I will say it once again, don't forget the community that you want to serve. They should be driving your research direction. It doesn't seem like the most scientific thing to do, but too often, as people in tech and people in science, we get separated from even our own community that we had as kids, and we really don't end up serving them at all. We kind of just do it because this is our job, or we just like to do analysis and like to look at data. But when you're thinking about social science conscious research, really don't forget the people who are who you're doing this for, and where you're coming from in whatever you decide to do your research on. For me, education disparity in New York City is huge. I was lucky, I got into tons of honors programs as a kid, so I never had to directly deal with it. But, many people do. Many people who look like me still do. And, anything that I can do to help is important to me. And I don't want to end up in a situation where I forget, why I'm here in the first place. And, definitely you should make sure that what you have is reflecting, what the community is telling you. And if it's not, if, your results do not reflect lived experience, think about why. Try to come up with reasons why. It could mean that you have an error in the very question, the way you framed the question, your data set, or even your analysis. And use the community to your advantage rather than working against them. It's very easy to kind of be like, well, the science says this. But in social science research, it gets very vague. When you're dealing with a society that's ever changing, there are a lot of things that just can't be quantified as specifically as we'd like. And there are a lot of things that very easily get, turned on their head in the next year or a few more months. And while it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have to kind of restart your whole project, it's something that you need to pay attention to. And, if you're thinking about serving your community, not paying attention to what they're saying could really, it could work against them, which is a huge, in my opinion, it's pretty unethical. But yeah, I'll let you, make your own decisions on the ethics of that. And even if your research does, reflect lived experiences of people in the community, make sure that you've included every angle. There were a lot of things that I really wanted to include as far as neighborhood features in particular that we just really didn't get to do because of time. And that was one of the things that I kind of listed in our, to-do pile for our next run. And that's something that you should definitely keep track of and try to include if you, eventually get access to the data. So don't fret if things do go wrong. Even if you've kind of made it all the way to the end of your analysis, social science research can take a very long time because of the fluidity of society and people. And people they give us a ton of data, but most of it is completely, it's in a format that we can't really use. And we'll just never really have enough data on human beings that will satisfy, any project that we really want to do. But what we can do is open the door for more research to be done and hopefully a door to meaningful and lasting social change. So I just want to give a thank you to my team at Microsoft who worked on the project with me, Glenda, Anastasia, Thomas, and our leads, Jake, Amit, and Jen. And then also Jennifer, who ran the program for us, and to everyone who encouraged me to give this talk. It's my first talk ever, so I was really nervous. And thank you to all of you for coming. And so I am a student at Queens College, graduating in May. So if you have questions, comments, or you want to recruit, please feel free to contact me. And that's it, guys. So thank you.
Do you think there would have been, well, you started off by talking about comparing, trying to get more apples to apples comparison, just using the streets themselves, side A versus side B, comparable properties, which would have isolated things. Typically, you wouldn't have cared as much about the subways or other, close to the parks. Would there have been enough data, do you think, solely maybe in Manhattan to have just compared properties on those criteria, just on the barriers of the school districts?
So,
or is there just not something that you could accomplish?
So we actually did really closely zoom in on Park Slope because that was where we had the most people who knew the most, and we had a fair amount of sales in Park Slope. And so we actually did find a pretty staggering difference between two areas in Park Slope. One was actually closer to the subway and one farther away. The one farther away had a better school, and the price there was, I think, larger per square foot by $83. So, you're thinking for an extra 1,000 square feet, you're paying $83,000 more than the other school zone. So we did, in some cases, really isolate it down to where we had a lot of data. I think that if we had probably gone specifically to Manhattan or certain areas in Brooklyn, we might have been able to kind of get more of that immediate staunch effect. But I think it would be pretty difficult just because the idea is that we would literally have to have kind of a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment with blah features right across the street from a 3-bedroom bathroom apartment with blah features. Yes?
So you do this on a zone basis, not just district, so that you have the zones within a district, so you could see, like in District 3 or District 2 in Manhattan, the differences of the schools?
We did it specifically by the zone. So zones are smaller than the district.
Right,
Mhm.
that's why I wanted to make sure. And you may have answered this, so I'm sorry if I missed it, but when you talked about rent versus owning, you
Mhm.
went with owning because it was hard to get the data on rent. But did you think of looking at, in a community, the percentage owned versus renting as some other variable that would impact the school?
So that was something, again, that was something that I argued with my supervisors with a lot because I felt that particularly in certain areas, there are just a lot of renters in certain areas versus a lot of buyers. And without kind of having some sense of the rentals, I felt that our numbers would be skewed. So it was something that we decided, well, my supervisor decided that we didn't have enough time to include, but it was something that I definitely wanted to tie in.
Did you feel that was because you wanted to know the rental price? Because I'm asking this not so much, because I understand your problem of the price for a three, how do you normalize that? But purely the percentage of homes rented, purely percentage rent versus own, not the actual price per square foot.
Yeah, we weren't even sure we would start trying to collect that data either. So, yeah, and at this point, we were already 2 weeks in and we had just gotten a clean data set. And then we changed our model about 5 times toward the end. So unfortunately, time limits really cut us down as far as doing much with the rentals.
Where did you get the rankings?
We're out of time for
Sorry, guys. You can feel free to, we can step out and guys can ask questions.